Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here in Nikšić. I would like to thank very much Ana and Slobo as the curators of the exhibition for putting on such an extraordinary work, to the director for his invite to me to come here this evening on behalf of the National Museum in Cetinje, and to our friends at Tehnopolis for hosting us. My lecture will last for about 45 minutes, so one half, so I'm sure you can all manage. I'm also really happy that so many players are here from Sutjeska Nikšić. I've watched you guys on YouTube. You can watch the Montenegrin League for free on YouTube. So I keep a close eye on the competition here and how everybody is doing, and I hope you have a good season ahead. Intersections between contemporary art and football is an important topic because often high art and football are seen at opposite ends of the spectrum. Two activities which have very little in common. Two groups of people who rarely intersect with one another, particularly in adulthood. But I want to show you this evening that there are many more parallels between contemporary art and football than at first glance we might expect. Look at the image here in my title slide. This is a Brazilian winger called Diego Santos Gariotza, who in 2020 was playing for the Belarusian football club Vitebsk in the Belarusian Premier League then. At that time, it was 100 years since the production of one of the most famous images in European art history. El Lissitzky's Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge from the period of the Russian Civil War. That image was made in Vitebsk. Now, one of the Vitebsk players, a central defender called Daniil Chalov, is very interested in art and runs a fashion company in Moscow. So he worked with his football club, the Vitebsk Museum of the Avant-Garde, and the local Jewish museum in Vitebsk to produce the shirt, which I am wearing. You can all see. Okay? This was one of the best-selling shirts in Europe in 2020. It became a sensation, completely outstripped the demands that Daniel expected for it. It's quite hard to find now, but it's one very good example of the relations between modern and contemporary art and football. But there are other points of intersection I'd like to introduce briefly. My problem was that as a child, I loved football, but I was rubbish at it. So if you want to participate in football, what is the next best thing? Well, you learn all about the history of the game, you follow it closely, you go to as many games as you can. These photographs were from a book I had as a child. It was old even then, written in the 1960s. And on the right, you see a shot from a game in the Hungarian League between Győr and Honvéd, famous Hungarian team. And the caption is, "Almost ballet," which I found interesting at the time. On the left-hand side is the great Brazilian winger Garrincha, who when he was playing in the 1958 World Cup was known as a force of nature. This is him dribbling his way past the Welsh defender Mel Hopkins from that team. How often have you heard a richly talented painter or artist described in the same way as a force of nature, as having a God-given talent? Even in the language that's used about the top artists and the top footballers, there is a lot for us to think about and to discuss. This is maybe slightly more controversial, but it relates to practice. I'm sure the lads from Sutjeska know in their team who is the best trainer and who is not very good at training or doesn't like training, doesn't like pre-season, which is very, very hard work. This leads to my next point. On the right, you have the first president of the English Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds. And Sir Joshua Reynolds was alive in the 18th century when football was a rowdy street game that worried the authorities of the time. The reason I mention him is that Sir Joshua said in his first discourses to the Royal Academy that no matter how gifted an artist, they had to practice and work on their talent every single day in order to realise it. So there is a condition where you can be born with too much anyone can see and play will recognise. At the same time, Zola was first on the training ground and last off it every single day. And that was the only way that his career lasted as long as it did as a player. So there is an issue there about talent and practice, who is a gift and who needs to work in that gift. And the answer is, never mind how talented you are, if you don't train, or if you're not in the studio every day as an artist, you won't go very far, or as far as you could. Another issue, which was very sensitively raised by Ana and Small in the exhibition in Cetinje, is the issue of women's football. I'm showing two examples from Scotland here, and one will astonish you. On the left is the painter from 100 years ago, Dorothy Johnston, and a painting she did called September Sunlight from 1916. During that time, women could work in art academies, but when they fell pregnant with their first child, they had to leave their job. That was the rule at the time, because the view was then that if you had a husband and family at home, you had no business working in an art academy. And this was written in to the contracts at the time. Dorothy was a phenomenal painter, 10 times the painter her husband was, I believe then. But she was the one who had to give up her career at that early stage. On the right is someone you will never have heard of here, Rose Riley. Now, if we're speaking of God-given talent, Rose Riley had it. Today, she's the ambassador for the Celtic women's team, and she is well known in Scotland. But when she was a player in the 1970s, she could only play until she was about 10 or 11 with young boys, only if she cut her hair short and called herself Ross, which is a boy's name in Scotland. Then, when she came of age, she was banned from playing because both the Scottish and the English football associations then banned women in the early 1920s, and that was a ban that continued into the 1980s in Scotland. But Rose wouldn't be denied. She moved to Italy. She played for the women's team of AC Milan. She played for Napoli. And because she was not allowed to play for Scotland, and there was no Scottish women's team, Rose captained the Italian women's team to the Women's World Cup equivalent victory in 1985. She's a legend in Italy. So this gives you an example of how talent in both football and both art historically has been thwarted, and how that quite rightly is changing in our times. There's also, I say relicization, which is probably strange for the translator. It's a word I've made up. It's the way in which football relics can be exhibited and acquire enormous value in the same way that works of art do. Now, objectively, this is a piece of polyester from 25 years ago with purple detailing on it and a badge. If you didn't know anything about football, what would you give for it in the flea market? 10 euros maybe. But actually, this is worth many, many thousand times that number. In the same way as the materials of contemporary art, a painting, a sculpture. In terms of the raw materials, these are worth nothing. It's the context and the scarcity of the object that creates the value, just as with Peđa Mijatovic's shirt here from the clip that we saw of him scoring the winning goal for Real against Juventus. One final thought before we start the lecture proper. Everybody knows Rade Antic. Poor Rade Antic passed away 3 years ago now. Wonderful player and really, really top-level coach. Probably if he was here, he would agree that he had a better career as a coach than as a footballer. But back in the 1980s, Yugoslavs could go to England after they were 28. The government said, okay, after 28 you can go abroad. He scored one of the most famous goals in Luton Town's history. A final day of the season, Luton Town were playing Manchester City at their old Main Road ground. Rade Antic scored the goal which saved Luton Town and relegated Manchester City. And let me tell you, when he died in 2020, there was just as much pain felt in Luton as there was in Belgrade and in Serbia. There is a campaign to have a statue of Rade Antic made for outside the Kenilworth Road ground. People say, well, it's not so important. It's a game from 40 years ago. Why are you rambling on about it? Who cares? It's folk memories like this that pass down through the generations. Just as we remember artists who lived in the 18th century, no one remembers them now who knew them and had coffee with them, but still their exploits are remembered in just the same way here as this goal is talked about obsessively by everyone who follows English football. It's also funny for this gif of their manager in this ridiculous brown suit and slip-ons dancing across the pitch, and people remember that just as much as Rade's goal. Okay. Let's talk seriously now a little bit about the four main ways in which we could compare art and football. Firstly, the personality of the artist and the footballer. Secondly, material relations in art and football. Thirdly, aestheticization. And finally, the institutions of art and football. Now, for the remainder of my lecture, I'll talk through these and try and be interesting at least a little bit. The personality of the artist and footballer, first of all, I've chosen 4 footballers to talk about quickly. Stanley Matthews, someone you'll all know very well, Dragoslav Šekularac, the legendary Red Star, OFK and Yugoslav footballer from the Chile World Cup, he was best known. Jim Baxter of Rangers in Scotland, and Eric Cantona, more from our time. Everyone remembers Cantona. This is Stanley Matthews here, and I would say that Stanley Matthews was the historical footballer, the first global celebrity in football. Everybody knew Stanley Matthews, and today I was talking with Uroš about the length of his shorts, and when I was a kid, if you wore shorts that length, everyone would laugh, because 1980 shorts were more like swimming trunks. But these shorts are coming back into fashion now. This is Stanley Matthews receiving the FA Cup from a young Queen Elizabeth in 1953, the legendary Matthews final, which you can still watch in its entirety on YouTube, between Blackpool and Bolton Wanderers. Blackpool were 3-1 down, but won the game 4-3 with 2 goals in the last 2 minutes. So it's still spoken of as the best FA Cup final of all time, the Matthews final. But Matthews was a Reynolds guy. He practiced every day. When he was interviewed by the media, he was very modest. He played down his talents, and he said, "My job, I am paid by my club to keep fit. Who could wish for a better job than that?" Matthews was still playing Premier League football, First Division football as it was back then, when he was 45. The image on the right is Matthews in his last season for Blackpool. shaking hands with a young Billy Bremner, the famous Leeds and Scotland captain when Leeds were a dominant side in the 1970s. And that's another parallel we can consider. Young artists love to be mentored by people like him, people who've been there and done it, to sit and talk, to learn from them, from their past, to try and adapt the lessons from his time into the time of their own, just in the same way as a young footballer will love to sit and listen to someone who's played at the highest level to try and see what they can learn from him. So there is this generational passage which is similar both in art and in football. Dragoslav Šukularac was very different, and I picked him largely because of his nickname, Romantičar, Umjetnik, an individualist, someone with very little patience for structures, particularly for officials, referees and the guys that wear ties and blazers from the association or in the director's box. He had a very hot temperament, and that temperament perhaps made him unfulfilled as a player. Dragoslav Šukularac was one of the standout players in the Chile World Cup of 1962, playing it inside right in a dominant Yugoslav midfield, one of the best teams of the tournament that ended up finishing fourth. And if you look back at the footage, they should have won it, really, that team. But it's difficult, of course, for European teams to win a World Cup in South America. After that, Dragoslav got into increasing problems with the authorities. He was suspended for a long time. He returned to play for OFK after leaving Red Star in less than happy circumstances. And even though he had some moderate success in Canada as a manager, as an older guy, he was someone who was unfulfilled. How many artists do you know that are unfulfilled? And this is something else I want us to think about. The rhythms of football and the rhythms of art. You guys in Sutjeska have a horrible 6 weeks of pre-season where the coach shouts at you, makes you run up the stand stairs, mountains, you're on bikes all day, you're mic'd up to these gym vests that record your every heartbeat. There's a guy taking data. The coach sits with you and goes through your data and says, I want you doing more of this. Or if you don't try harder, you're not going to be in my team in the first game of the season. Just the same as for an artist. An artist has 6 months to put together an exhibition if they are lucky. They have people calling them at all times of the days and nights. A neurotic curator, an angry director, a journalist wanting an interview. To try and speak to all these people and keep them happy and at the same time be in the studio and work. There's too many jobs at once. And then it's opening night and everyone shakes your hand, you get a bunch of flowers, and the next day you're sitting in an empty gallery thinking, is that it? In the same way as a top footballer, a Roy Keane, wins the Champions League in 1999. 4 weeks later, he's back in pre-season. And on the first day, back at pre-season, looking around, having won the trophy that everyone would give their right arm to win who loves football. Looking around his teammates, the same people, and going, is that it? That emptiness that is common to the footballer and artist, that maybe some of you recognise. Jim Baxter, a legend of Scottish football. Unfortunately, Dragoslav Šukularac plus alcohol. It's a very sad story, actually. Jim came from a mining village in Scotland. His family were all miners. Back in the 1950s, it was very difficult for a young working class man to be anything other than a miner in that region of Scotland. And football, along with boxing, was a way out of that horrible life. Jim Baxter started playing local football. He learned first, every time he received the ball and passed it on to a teammate, to jump as high as he could, because someone would be coming in trying to cripple him at that level of football. He ended up at Glasgow Rangers, and from 1963 to 1967, there were few people in the world to touch Jim Baxter. The most famous game was, and you can find it on YouTube, when Scotland beat England at Wembley in 1967. That's the slide on the right. The year after England had won the World Cup. And us Scots like to think of ourselves as having been unofficial world champions for 3 years on the basis of that victory. Jim Baxter, during that game against the best team in the world, was doing keepy-uppies in the middle of the park and daring Bobby Moore and the like to come and get the ball off him. A display of what we call, and this is your Scottish word for the night, gallus, a mixture of ability, arrogance, and a light-heartedness about the game, not caring too much what the outcome is, as long as everybody who's there enjoys themselves and sees a show. Sadly, Jim, later in life, was a very self-destructive guy. His career was finished before he was 30. He had major problems with alcohol in later life, and he died far too young in 2001. Again, listening to that story, there are many artists, unfortunately, whose life that could be in a different context. Finally, Eric Cantona, more from our time. On the left is Eric Cantona's infamous kung fu kick in a game between Crystal Palace and Manchester United at Selhurst Park in 1996. And Eric was wound up by an opposition defender, and he got himself a red card. And as he was walking off, Selhurst Park's quite a tight ground. As he was walking off, he got some racist abuse from a spectator in the stand, and that produced this kung fu kick, which saw him suspended for 9 months. But if anything, it strengthened Eric's bond with the club, Manchester United, and his then manager, the legendary Sir Alex Ferguson, who defended him, having understood the context of why he had done what he had done. Normally, a coach won't forgive someone who can't control up here, because football is 70-80% up here. If you have a wind-up merchant on the opposing team, someone there to make you angry, you must ignore him. All coaches say that. Don't rise to it. But Sir Alex, once he understood what had provoked this, stood by him, and Eric returned in triumph. This produced this wonderful painting by Michael Brown, in which Eric Cantona is shown almost in Roman style, with, if you can see in the top right, Sir Alex Ferguson as a modern-day Roman emperor, and his teammates, you'll recognise Scholes, Butt in the foreground, and Beckham all in the foreground at the bottom there.
But this is the resurrection of Christ.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, that's exactly the point. So move on to material relations. One of the big disparities that people think there are between art and football is class. In the British context, it'd be interesting to hear what it's like in Montenegro. But art is seen as being for the middle and upper classes in my country. Many people won't go to art galleries because they're like, oh, I won't fit in there. That's not for me. It's a very deep-rooted thing. And that's why this exhibition for me is so interesting, because it's a fundamental challenge to that preconception. Just as in the same way a middle or upper class person in the middle of a bunch of ultras might feel uncomfortable at some of the language being used or some of the behaviour being displayed. So there is a disparity of class, and also a disparity, we might say, in wages. Yeah? In my country, 10% of artists, working artists, earn over 10,000 euros a year. So all the others are doing other jobs to top up this money to keep themselves alive, right? It's pretty much the same with footballers. People see the Haalands, they look perhaps at the Beckhams earning $10 million by endorsing 3 products in one afternoon and think all footballers are like that. Absolutely not. There is a great parallel between footballers' wages and artists' wages. I hope the chairman of Sutjeska isn't here this evening and he thinks I'm calling for a pay rise for the guys. The career paths of artists and footballers are also very similar. In an art academy, every year, out of 80 students, in a good year, 5 will make it as working artists at some professional level. That's an enormous attrition rate. It's also the same with professional academies in the UK. 1 or 2 young people out of 100 will make it as a professional from Premier League academies. Okay? I show as an illustration here, we've spoken about high and low culture already. I show as an illustration here the most famous painting of football in the UK by the British artist L.S. Lowry, and it's called Going to the Match from 1953. Lowry is a household name in the UK. And it's a picture of Bolton Wanderers' old ground, Burnden Park, and the crowd filing in for the match. You can see in the background cotton mills and factories which no longer exist, just as the ground doesn't either. But this is a typical artist's perception of a football crowd from this time. There are also footballers who play at a very high level who don't like football, just as there are artists who make art and hate it. With artists, it's more of an up and down thing. You have success, you love it. You have a difficult couple of days in the studio and you hate it. Why did I do this to myself, becoming an artist? One good example is the Leeds and England footballer David Batty, who since he retired at the beginning of our century has retired into private life. He refuses to comment on football. He didn't even go to the reunion of his Leeds team a few years back. David Batty was a remarkable defensive midfielder, overshadowed by Roy Keane in his time, who played for the great rivals Manchester United. But a really talented footballer. You can see him here, this little boy here, in Leeds City Boys in the early 80s, and this is him at Leeds as a mature player. But since he retired, he doesn't want anything to do with football. It's really rather interesting. There are both artists and footballers who make a living from the game, but fall out of love with it or actively don't like it. And when they're finished, they effectively turn their back on it, which for me is interesting. Move on now to aestheticization. This is a cigarette card. And before, photography was common in newspapers, and before sticker albums for children were common, this was one of the ways in which people got to know their footballers very well. They collected whole stacks of them. This is the Scotland great Jock Stein, who was manager of Scotland until tragically he died during an international against Wales and Cardiff in 1985 as a cigarette card from the 40s. But it also shows a link between football, art, and the commodity. Footballers and footballers are used to sell things. And this is not a new thing. This is something that's been going on for many, many decades, to sell cigarettes in this case. There are also painters who take subject as their football as their subject. This is one of my former students, David Ray, young man about you guys' age. Paint sporting infrastructure, and also, I don't know if any of you have ever been in an abandoned football stadium or an empty football stadium, but it's really strange. It's a really odd, spooky feeling somehow, that everyone who's meant to be there is not there. You're there on your own, and it feels rather strange. So he uses colour contrasts and emptiness to try and convey this feeling of solitude and emptiness. But perhaps better known are football murals. These are famous murals in Sarajevo, a city where I've spent an awful lot of time and where my wife is from. This is Edin Dzeko, of course, the diamond of Bosnia and Herzegovina. on the left, and Ivica Osim, and his famous quotation from 1992 at Grbavica Stadium, the stadium of Željo, my football team in Sarajevo, on the right. After Ivica Osim died recently, they painted this mural of him. But aestheticisation goes beyond painting and goes beyond murals or ultra-culture. They're also in films. I want to consider 3 examples briefly. You can find this on YouTube, and I encourage you to look at it when you have a quiet afternoon on YouTube. Helmut Kostard's film Fotbal wie noch nie, Football as You've Never Seen It Before, filmed in 1970, when he took 8 cameras to film a First Division match between Manchester United and Coventry City. Manchester United won 2-0, but the game and the result was not important. What was important was that these 8 cameras just focused on George Best and what he gave during that game. How sometimes it was effortless, sometimes he was hurt, all the different phases of a footballer's life. And for the time, this was revolutionary. Nowadays, we all have Sky Sports, betting companies run television with slow-mo, with close-ups. Players cover their mouths so the audience at home can't lip read to see what they're saying. Back then, this was an insight into football that was quite unprecedented. I was reminded of it at the show by Natalia Vujosiewicz's piece Fire 10, made as a student, and you all know that piece very well. But I loved the way that showed fire in a moment of coolness, when Zidane took the winning penalty for France against Portugal in Euro 2000 with 3 minutes left of extra time. I have no idea what that feels like. To have 60,000 people in a stadium watching you, goodness knows how many people watching you around the world, and to have the single-mindedness to pretend they don't exist. And it's only you and the goalkeeper, and you know exactly where the ball's going, and you won't be deflected. That is extraordinary single-mindedness, which reminds me of durational performance artists. Perhaps a Marina or a Rasha Todosiewicz from Belgrade in the 70s at their earliest. That's single-mindedness. I want to mention my friend Douglas Gordon. Let's go back one. Sometimes artists can be accused of being a bit opportunist about football. They don't really know football, but they make an artwork anyway because it's fashionable, whatever. Certainly in my country anyway. Douglas Gordon, who's perhaps Scotland's best known living artist, is really passionate about football. I'm showing you this game because the team in yellow and red is his team in Glasgow, Partick Thistle, in a cup match against the Fife Miners team, Cowdenbeath. And you can see that Cowdenbeath are amateur to semi-professional by the state of their centre half here. He certainly didn't train very much, but he still played the full game. Cowdenbeath surprisingly won this game 1-0, and it was a cup shock, and I was at this game with Douglas 30 years ago. I was reminded of it recently. Douglas Gordon's best known work, like Natalia, also deals with Zinedine Zidane. He made with Philippe Parano, Zidane, a 21st century portrait from 2006. This is, like Helmut Kostard, expands on the methodology. I don't know if Douglas knew about this earlier film. It's really not clear. But he used 27 or 28 cameras with Philippe Parano placed around the stadium during a home match with Real Madrid, which they won, but in which Zidane was sent off. It was a game in which you saw like never before how much an elite athlete gives in one game. And as spectators, we only see footballers 2 hours a week. We don't see you in training. We don't see you in your life away from football. We just see you for 2 hours a week, for that brief moment of connection. What this shows is what that 2 hours is like whilst we're all shouting at you from the terraces. What that 2 hours is like for the footballer, and just how much they give, how much they are exhausted at the end. You understand watching this film how footballers in their middle 30s are like, really don't feel like it today. The recovery time after every game gets more and more and more. Knocks and injuries that you can shrug off from your 20 overnight or in a day or two take 2 or 3 days in your mid-30s, and the coach has to give you more time to recover. So this for me is a really interesting portrait of what a footballer gives, and I would love one day to show this to young cadets, young age group teams, 15, 17, 19s, and the seniors, of course, just to see what they think of this film as footballers. I approach it as an artist, art historian, an art person, but to hear your insight into what you recognise from that film and to create that new knowledge together would be incredibly valuable, I think. I'm coming to the end now. So I wanted to, in the last few slides, just do a brief comparison of how we can make parallels between the two worlds. Institutions in art and football. You have the Football Association, or you have, in my country, the Royal Academy, the Royal Scottish Academy. They oversee the production of art, they set the standards, they encourage and support artists to the extent that they have the money to do so. The clubs, the galleries, publicly or privately funded. The players, artists, of course. The dressing room, the studio. Now that's the tricky one, because of course a dressing room features 14, 15 guys. And you all spend 9 months with them. It's like, oh God, these guys again. You know, it can be tiring sometimes. But you know them, you know everything about them, you know who you like and you don't like, because not every dressing room is harmonious. The studio is less a solitary place than we might think, and the team behind an artist can be just, not always, but can be just as strong as a team in a football context. The fans and audiences, the ownership of an artwork, and the ownership of a club, and collectors of art, specialist medias. Everybody knows who writes a good football article. You could write a wonderful history of writing about football, not just the playing of football, but who wrote about it and who did well at it and who is worthy of remembering. Rumour and innuendo. There is as much rumour and innuendo in art as there is in football, and I know both worlds very well. You hear him, he's away to Dundee United, they're paying 50 grand for him. My friend's cousin's an agent. Aye, right. That's really true. But rumours like that appear on the internet, they're on Twitter, on Facebook, and suddenly your star player is moving to Dundee United, even though he has never spoken to anyone from them at all. The same in art. So-and-so has fallen out with so-and-so. This curator is terrible. In the same way as, don't go and play for that manager. He's too much of a disciplinarian. You'll have a horrible time working with him. So rumour and innuendo are really important in both discourses. Programmes, catalogues, material culture. Nowadays, the top footballers are also fashion people. They appear in backlit fashion shoots wearing a piece of polyester. So mugs like me go and spend 50 euros buying the piece of polyester. It's a huge business, football merchandising now. And relicization, as we've spoken about already. You might be wondering who this auctioneer is and what this shirt is. That was the shirt that Jim Baxter wore in the game I was telling you about earlier against England in 1967. It was up for auction. Finally, and briefly, this is one of the most famous football photographs of all time. And an artist couldn't have picked it better, but it was just momentary. It was Stanley Matthews playing in the Matthews final, coming up against his opponent, Malcolm Barras of Bolton Wanderers. Matthews dragged back against Barras and crossed, and the winner was scored from this moment in the game. And it's for that reason, not just the way in which it's wonderfully composed, it's for that reason it's one of the most famous photographs and football history in my country at least. The artist group Zvono in the 1980s, you can find this on YouTube from a colleague of mine, Nebojša Šerić-Šoba, wonderful artist from Bosnia who now lives in New York. Nebojša has put many works from Zvono on his timeline. And this is an action that was done in Koševo Stadium in Sarajevo, where the football crowd was there to see FK Sarajevo. But beforehand, the Zvono players ran on with their easels and their canvas, and they started painting in the middle of the pitch. And the crowd was cheering and clapping along as though they were watching a football game. So this is one of the most explicit references to making art in a football context. This is Nebojša's work here. He's a big FK Sarajevo fan. So this showing the moment of defeat in the late 90s shows a young man wearing an FK Sarajevo shirt. And lastly, from my country, the work of the artist Roderick Buchanan. This is work in progress from 1995. Roderick is a wonderful conversationalist. He gets on naturally with strangers. He can have them talking as though they were old friends within 5 minutes. All of these guys are not Inter or AC Milan players. They're amateur players like me who bought the shirt and wore it playing five-a-side. And he was interested to speak to them and show why ordinary guys from Glasgow would choose to identify with an emerging global football brand and buy into that. What was the motivation? Why are you wearing this shirt? You're Glaswegian. You've never been to Milan in your life. And of course, they're buying in with the great players of the day. And I think AC were more dominant than Inter in the Berlusconi years of the 1990s. This is Roddy as well, in a cut that he did with the Portuguese curator, Nuno Sacramento. This was Art Cup, done between 2004 and 2006. And this is a fascinating project, because it's the only project, other than Zvono that I know of, that explicitly held football and art as equal. This was a World Cup, if you like, of teams made up of artists. Now, to get on the team, it didn't matter how good an artist you were. You had first and foremost to be a competent footballer. So there were many famous artists from Scotland who wanted to play in this team, but they weren't good enough as footballers, so they were not included. Alongside a game, there was also an exhibition of all the artists who had played a game in football. So the game and the exhibition went hand in hand, and new relationships were forged as a result. Uroš will say more about this experience, because Nuno and Roddy played for the Scottish artist team in Belgrade against the Serbian artist team 15, 20 years ago now. 20 years ago. 17, yeah.
But I got to tell you, I'm sorry, he deliberately told me that it was completely the opposite. He was insisting that they got to be not only excellent football players, but excellent artists as well. So he wouldn't accept shitty artists who played very good football. No, that's he insisted, understood. No, they must be just brilliant artists as well.
But some very good artists didn't get on the team. I should have clarified.
They had to be both, so good football players and good artists.
And good artists. So this picture was taken at Huntly, which is a small club in Scotland in 2005. Very quickly, Graham Coulthard's piece done for, I think, the UK Olympics in 2012. I was living in Bosnia at the time, so I didn't see it. But this was a piece where the artist made a football pitch and a small stand in the middle of a remote forest and held a game. It was quite controversial because some people didn't like the fact that a forest was cut down to make this pitch appear. But after the match and after the event, which was backed by our equivalent of the Ministry of Culture at the time, the football pitch was forgotten, and this has all gone back to forests now. So it was a piece about the cycles of nature and football and art pulled together. Lastly, just to prove that I do actually play football, this is the Scottish artist team playing against a team of Belarusian exiles in Scotland in 2021. At this time, there was a football journalist called Alexander Ivulin who fell foul of the regime in Belarus and was put in prison. And to raise awareness of his case, we organised a football match between the Scottish artist team. This is Roddy Buchanan on the right again, and the Belarusians. The Belarusians won 11-8, and my friend said to me when I went home, I didn't realise you were playing them at rugby. But this was a small game which raised that cause substantially more than any lecture like this or activist meeting or any traditional political discourse like that. We raised the profile of a young man over there who was in prison unjustly, and we named the cup that we played for after him. He lives in Poland now, he's out of prison, and the condition was that whichever team won the cup had to present it to him when he was out. And he has this cup and the shirt we made for the Belarusian team with him now in Poland. So this was an activist event that used art and used the power of football to raise awareness of an issue that football on its own, or art on its own, or activism on its own simply could not achieve. Well, I'd like to conclude there, just more or less in time. I hope it's been interesting. It gives Uroš now something to respond to, and that you've enjoyed finding out a little bit about football and its histories and how we might think of it in terms of art. Thank you very much.